Welcome back. This is part two of our discussion on March 12th. After having discussed the end of Republic 1, where Socrates leads us through that sharp, crisp, highly conceptual discussion of why it's always better for us to be just than to be unjust, based on that analysis of a thing's function and a thing's virtue. We are now going to engage with Glaucon, who is going to reiterate Thrasymachus's argument, kind of double down on that argument on the grounds that Socrates hasn't really convinced us at all on the basis of that highly conceptual argument, that function argument at the end of book 1. So book 2 opens with Socrates saying, "When I had said this," and he means the function argument, "I thought I had done with the discussion, but it turned out to have been only a prelude." Glaucon showed his characteristic courage on this occasion, too, and refused to accept Thrasymachus's abandonment of the argument. "Socrates," said Glaucon, "do you want to seem to have persuaded us that it's better in every way to be just than unjust? Or do you want to truly convince us of this?" Of course, Socrates responds that he truly wants to convince them that it's better to be just than to be unjust. He does not want the mere appearance of having convinced them. At this point, Glaucon introduces what's known in the philosophical literature as the threefold classification of goods. The reason why Glaucon is presenting a classification of goods is because he's ultimately going to want Socrates to tell him what kind of good justice is. The threefold classification is meant to be an exhaustive account of the ways in which anything in the world that counts as good can count as good. So let's look through this threefold classification so we can get our minds around what kinds of classes Glaucon has in mind, and then we can engage with the question of where Socrates wants to place justice. The first class of goods, Glaucon tells us at 357b, includes the kinds of things that we welcome not because we desire what comes from that good thing, but because we welcome that thing for its own sake. He gives us the example of joy and all the harmless pleasures that have no results beyond the joy of having them. We might include in this class things like enjoying a sunset, enjoying a walk on the beach, enjoying dinner with friends, a nice bottle of wine, though I'm sure none of you have ever imbibed wine. Things that you don't expect any kind of good consequence to come from them. But your reason for indulging in that good is because the good itself brings something great to your life. The second class of goods, by contrast, are things that Glaucon says we like for their own sake and also for the sake of what comes from them. He gives the example of knowing and seeing and being healthy. These are things that we enjoy because it's fun to know things and it's fun to see things and it's great to be healthy, but also we derive a lot of benefits from those things. So we can navigate our world better if we have knowledge and we're able to see and we are healthy. So there are good consequences that come from those things, but we also enjoy them for their own sake. So that gives us two of the classes of goods. The third class of goods are those things which are good because of what comes from them. These include, he tells us, physical training, medical treatment when sick, medicine, and other ways of making money. So these are all things that we don't engage in for their own sake, but we pursue them because the consequences that we can enjoy as a result of those things are really great. Notice that money making is in there. Glaucon is saying that if you're trying to make money just for the sake of making money, then you've missed what money is good for. Money is not a good in itself. Money is only valuable. It only counts as a good because of something that comes from having money. So these are the three types of goods. They're organized according to where their value lies. Is the value intrinsic? Is the value both intrinsic and consequential? Or is the value only consequential? That's the threefold classification of goods. Then Glaucon he asks Socrates, to which class does justice belong? So we can see this question at 357D. Where do you put justice, Socrates? Socrates answers, I myself put it among the finest goods, as something to be valued by anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness, both because of itself and because of what comes from it. So Socrates is saying, I value justice as a good in the second category, in the second class of goods. Glaucon responds to this by saying that even though he himself thinks that justice is a second class good, he thinks that the folk or the common person will classify justice as a third class good, as something that is good only because of what comes from it. It's a consequential good. It has no intrinsic value. The way that he substantiates this claim is by returning to some of what Thrasymachus had pointed out about the idea that the unjust person is going to reap a whole lot of rewards if they're willing to be very thoroughgoing in pursuing their injustice, and that the just person is someone who is always going to be taken advantage of. We can see this at the top of the next page. So at 358E, Glaucon starts to say, they say, and he's referring to the folk here, the folk say that to do injustice is naturally good, and to suffer injustice is bad, but that the badness of suffering it so far exceeds the goodness of doing it, that those who have done and suffered injustice and tasted both, but who lack the power to do it and avoid suffering it, decide that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. Here we see an introduction of the notion of a social contract, a set of laws or a covenant, to use Glaucon's words here, whereby a community of people agree that they are going to abide by certain norms of behavior so that collectively they can all benefit from one another. The idea is that everyone will agree to obey certain laws of against stealing, against murdering, against other ways of taking advantage of their fellow citizen, so that no one has to live in fear that another person is going to take advantage of them with impunity. So by entering into the contract and knowing that everybody else is entering into the contract, you can rest assured that if anybody tries to screw you over, they will have to deal with the justice system. So they are strongly disincentivized to try to take advantage of you. So in trusting the system to protect you from being taken advantage of, the cost of that is that you have to agree to also not take advantage of others. For the folk, this counts as a second best life, because the very best life in their consideration, according to Glaucon, is the life whereby they can take advantage of everyone else with impunity. But they don't want to be taken advantage of, so they agree to the second best life. But then it looks like the folk are committed to the idea that justice is only an instrumental good, right? It's just the consequences, that consequence of being safe from being taken advantage of is the only reason to engage in justice. There's no good in itself of engaging in just behavior or agreeing to a just social contract. The justice is something that falls out of it. You don't get to kind of enjoy that life for its own sake. That's the charge that Glaucon is making on behalf of the folk. That's what he's saying most people take justice to be. So that's his explanation of the folk view. One of the ways that he formulates this is at 359C. He says, to outdo others and get more and more. This is what anyone's nature naturally pursues as good. But nature is forced by law into the perversion of treating fairness with respect. Again, he's voicing the folk view here. But the folk view, according to this articulation, is that deep down, human beings are hardwired to take advantage of one another. So we can't rely on people just naturally getting along in order for us to, be able to avoid being taken advantage of. If we don't try to actually rein in people with a social contract, with these norms and these agreements, then people will be left to their own nature and they are going to pursue that unjust behavior, the cheating, the murdering, the stealing. That's what they're naturally going to do. He tries to illustrate this point by using an example at 359c to d. The example comes from the ancestor of Gyges of Lydia. He says, the story goes that he was a shepherd in the service of a ruler of Lydia. There was a violent thunderstorm, and an earthquake broke open the ground and created a chasm at the place where he was tending his sheep. What we're going to see is that he's going to find a ring, and we're going to have a story very similar to something like you'd see in The Lord of the Rings with the ring that makes people invisible. So what happens is the ancestor of Gyges is tending his sheep. Here we can see some sheep in this image here. And seeing that a chasm had been created by an earthquake, he was filled with amazement. He went down into the chasm. And there, in addition to many other wonders of which we're told, he saw a hollow bronze horse. You can see the bronze horse in this image here in the bottom right. Bottom left, I mean. There were window-like openings on the bronze horse, and peeping in, he saw a corpse, which seemed to be of more than human size, wearing nothing but a gold ring on its finger. He took the ring and came out of the chasm. He wore the ring at the usual monthly meeting that reported to the king on the state of the flocks. And as he was sitting among the others, he happened to turn the setting of the ring toward himself to the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting near him, and they went on talking as if he had gone. So you can see what he's doing. He has a ring, right, that has some kind of signet or something on one side. And when he turns that inside, he becomes completely invisible. But when he turns it back out, he becomes visible again, right? He wondered at this, and fingering the ring, he turned the setting outwards again and became visible. So he experimented with the ring to test whether indeed it had this power, and it did. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. When he realized this, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and took over the kingdom. Look at how fast that happened at the end. When he realized what the ring could do, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and took over the kingdom. And what the story shows is that this ancestor of Gyges has a pretty nasty psychology. He's inclined to take advantage of others. When given a chance to do so with impunity, he jumps at the chance. He doesn't delay at all, right? So we're meant to see that he is naturally disposed toward that kind of unjust behavior. Glaucon's charge is that everybody, in fact, is disposed towards that kind of unjust behavior, and that all we really need for our true colors to shine through is a ring like the ring that the ancestor of Gyges possessed. With having a ring like that in our hands, we would certainly turn towards that kind of bad behavior. This position is called psychological egoism. It's a position that kind of recurs throughout the history of philosophy. We see it in Hobbes, who posited a psychological egoism kind of a claim in his work. The claim here, notice, is a descriptive claim. It's a claim about the way that we are psychologically hardwired. It's not a normative claim. Glaucon isn't trying to endorse this claim about our psychology. He's not saying that we should be psychological egoists. He's saying that we are psychological egoists. In contrast, we might say that Thrasymachus was actually endorsing psychological egoism. He was endorsing the idea that we should be after what's to our own advantage, that that's actually a better life. Glaucon, on the other hand, makes the descriptive claim about psychological egoism. Or we might say he makes that claim on behalf of the folk. So the folk are psychological egoists. They believe that we are hardwired this way. But he wants to engage with the normative claim, right? He wants Socrates to answer the question of whether or not that unjust life could possibly be better than the just life. He wants Socrates to actually take on what Thrasymachus had put forward as a notion of the good life. So Glaucon, right after presenting this psychological egoist interpretation of human nature on behalf of the folk, finally formulates his challenge in his own words. We see this at 360 D to E. As for the choice between the lives we're discussing, we'll be able to make a correct judgment about that only if we separate the most just and the most unjust. Otherwise, we won't be able to do it. Here's the separation I have in mind. So here, Glaucon is going to present a thought experiment. He wants us to imagine. He wants us to imagine something. Here's the separation I have in mind. We'll subtract nothing from the injustice of an unjust person and nothing from the justice of a just one, but we'll take each to be complete in his own way of life. So here he's going to examine justice and injustice separately for what they are in their own essence. So he's going to engage with the question, the kind of what is question about justice and injustice. We'll subtract nothing from the injustice of an unjust person and nothing from the justice of a just one, but we'll take each to be complete in his own way of life. So we can examine each on its own. First, therefore, we must suppose that an unjust person will act as clever craftsmen do. A first-rate captain or a doctor, for example, knows the difference between what his craft can and can't do. He attempts the first, but lets the second go by. And if he happens to slip, he can't put things right. In the same way, an unjust person's successful attempts at injustice must remain undetected. So the unjust person is going to be so thoroughgoing in their unjust life that they're going to be able to cover all of their tracks. So we're imagining that ancestor of Gyges who always uses the ring effectively, and no one ever knows that he's the one who murdered the king, that he's the one who had kind of overturned the kingdom for his own benefit. Anyone who is caught, so an unjust person that's caught, should be thought inept. For the extreme of injustice is to be believed to be just without being just. Right? So we're to imagine an unjust person who's completely unjust, but they are thought to be just. So they have a reputation for justice, even though they are thoroughly, completely, entirely unjust. He has this reputation because he never slips. He never errs in his unjust activities. Our completely unjust person must be given complete injustice. Nothing may be subtracted from it. We must allow that while doing the greatest injustice, he has nonetheless provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. If he happens to make a slip, he must be able to put it right. If any of his unjust activities should be discovered, he must be able to speak persuasively or to use force. And if force is needed, he must have the help of courage and strength and of substantial wealth and friends with which he has provided himself. Beside him, we set up a perfectly just person who has a reputation for injustice. So we're to imagine a person who behaves rightly, always complies with the law, assuming that the law is actually just. So this is a person who behaves in all the ways that are actually just. There's a question, of course, about what justice is, but we will get to it. But this person behaves in all the ways that are absolutely just, but they are thought by all of their community to be unjust. So they're thrown into prison. They're tortured. They're treated really badly. They have a reputation for being terrible, and they are dishonored in their community. Exactly opposite to the perfectly unjust person. In setting up the just person in this way, we can separate the intrinsic value of justice from the consequences that are ordinarily attached to justice. We don't have to think that the value of the just person's life comes from the honors and the rewards that they get for their justice. We're going to have to ask that hard question of whether or not it's worthwhile to be a just person, even if you have to live in prison, even if you are tortured on the rack. This really puts a lot of pressure on Socrates' claim that it's always better to live a just life, to be a just person, than it is to be an unjust person. If Socrates can prove to us that it is better to be a just person tortured on a rack than to be an unjust person who enjoys a palace as a home and riches and friends and companions who adore him, then Socrates will have shown us that justice is always valued for its own sake, always more valuable for its own sake than injustice ever could be. So that's the challenge that Glaucon wants to put forward. He says, in this way, both will reach the extremes. This is reiterating that point. Both will reach the extremes, the one of justice and the other of injustice, and we will be able to judge which of them is happier. That's Glaucon's challenge. It's a challenge for Socrates because it's Socrates who is claiming that it's always better to be just than to be unjust. If Socrates is able to answer this question, he will have defeated Thrasymachus' claim from Book 1, but he'll also have given us a kind of moral lesson about the value of justice in our life. So there's a kind of practical value in what Socrates is doing that you might see over and beyond any of the practical value of his conversations in the other dialogues. The pressure that Thrasymachus and Glaucon are putting on him to make his philosophical activities really useful shows that what Socrates has been up to with others may not look especially useful. It really comes into practice here, where we can make progress in how to live our lives. We can actually tend to those most important things that we had heard about in the Apology. So what I'd like to hear from you guys in your discussion is what you think about this challenge. What do you think about the formulation of it? What do you think about the example of the ring of Gyges and this idea that we are hardwired to be psychological egoists? Do you think that the folk are right, in the way that Glaucon has presented them? And do you think that Glaucon has presented a challenge for Socrates that's worthwhile? Is this something that we should take an interest in? So tell me what you think. I'm eager to hear.